Today we are going to be tackling a really, in many ways, a difficult topic. Maybe in other ways, a much easier topic. We're going to find out tonight. If any of you have ever had a relative or a loved one who was really terribly sick in their elder days, lost a lot of their independence and their freedom, was basically kind of just waiting to leave, I think you will have experienced the emotional side of the topic that we're talking about today, the topic of euthanasia, the topic of whether it is right to terminate a life at the behest of the person themselves, or possibly if they're not conscious or not able to make a voluntary decision, maybe without their permission. On the other hand, there is the whole question of, is it ever right to take another human life? Is that really something that we human beings can make a decision about for each other or even for ourselves? If it is God who gives life, should it not be God who is the sole person who is allowed to take away that life once again? So these are very difficult and complex issues. To help us bring some clarity to a dark area, we have with us today, and we're very privileged to have with us today, Professor Margot Somerville. I'll briefly just run through a very brief bio so you know who you are listening to today. She's currently a Professor of Bioethics at the University of Notre in Australia. She hails originally from Adelaide, but we won't hold that against her. She has degrees, and degrees is plural, in pharmacy and law, and she was the university medalist at the University of Sydney, I think in the law degree that she completed there. She then went on to work at McGill University for quite a while in Montreal in Canada, in many different capacities, including professorships both in the faculties of medicine and the faculty of law. And she was the founding director of the McGill Centre for Medicine, Ethics and Law. She delivered 5 Massey lectures on Canadian radio in 2006 and later published an expanded version of those lectures as a book called The Ethical Imagination: Journeys of the Human Spirit. She's published numerous other books and too many articles to count. I'm not even going to try and mention any of them. Other books include The Ethical Canary, Science, Society and the Human Spirit, and Death Talk, The Case Against Euthanasia and Physician-Assisted Suicide. So I think that gives you a little bit of an idea on which side of the argument she's going to come down tonight. But if you haven't worked it out yet, I'm sure you will soon. In 1990, she was made a member of the Order of Australia for service to the law and to bioethics, and that's just one of many awards that she's received through her life. She's also received numerous honorary degrees from a large number of universities in Canada and our own Macquarie University here in Sydney. She's a very thoughtful person who has thought about these issues very deeply, very carefully, has engaged over the years with lots of people from many different backgrounds, with many different perspectives in dialogue and discussion on these kinds of issues. And she sets the topic of euthanasia within a context of a broader trend in Western society these days, where we are changing how we think about what a human being is and what the value of a human life is and how we should think about that. So we really are very privileged and very blessed to have Margot with us tonight, and without boring you any further, we'll pass over the microphone to her.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for coming. I wanted to start with something that I hadn't included in my notes because I hadn't remembered that a lot of people don't understand what is and what is not euthanasia. So just let me give you a little bit on that. Euthanasia is when, and usually it's confined to the medical scene, and it's a doctor giving, the easiest example is a doctor giving a person a lethal injection with the primary intention of ending that person's life in order to relieve suffering of the person And usually the person has to be competent and have given their informed consent to the lethal injection. Physician-assisted suicide is when the doctor prescribes a large amount of medication for a patient, which if taken all at once would kill the patient, and the doctor prescribes it knowing that the patient wants to take it all at once and is probably going to do so. Some jurisdictions just allow assisted suicide. The American states that have legalized these sorts of interventions, they only allow assisted suicide, although Oregon is now looking at expanding it to allow euthanasia. The Victorian legislation that's been passed here in Australia puts assisted suicide as the primary method of getting killed. But if the person's incapable of doing that, then the doctor can administer euthanasia. So that's like the default position. And Canada, which has got a wide open law, allows both euthanasia and assisted suicide. But it's very interesting that they predicted that there would be very few cases of either. But so far in the first 2 years, there have been at least 8,000 cases, and only 0.1% of those cases were suicide. The rest were all euthanasia. And certainly in the Netherlands and Belgium and Liechtenstein, which also allow euthanasia, the vast majority, in fact, there's barely a suicide case. They're almost all euthanasia. So one of the questions that arises is, why is euthanasia so popular if it's allowed to be done, and assisted suicide is not? And I think that's an area where we have to look into why that is happening. My own theory about it is that we've got deep moral intuitions against killing ourselves, against committing suicide, and it's much harder to do that. But when you can say to somebody else, just give me a lethal injection, and the way that it's normalised, well, doctors are people who give you injections, so, what's a big deal about that? Except for the fact that you end up dead at the end of it. So there's a lot of work to be done there. The other thing is there's a statistic that 1 in 23 deaths in the Netherlands and Belgium are by euthanasia. In other words, it's around about 4.7% of all deaths are by euthanasia. And we see this happening, the rate going up. The predictions are that by 2025, 25% of all deaths will be by euthanasia in the Benelux countries. That's the Netherlands and Belgium. Because what happens is that this gets normalised as a way of dying. So 1 in 23 deaths done under the law in those countries, but only 1 in 223 deaths are by assisted suicide in Oregon. So again, you see this huge discrepancy. So that's what euthanasia and assisted suicide are. And equally important, and this is really important to understand, what is not euthanasia. So people's refusal of life support treatment is not euthanasia. Fully adequate pain management or management of physical symptoms and the treatment is necessary is not euthanasia. Now, one of the things that the pro-euthanasia people have done, and we'll go into this, this is in my lecture, is that they say those are euthanasia, and then they say, well, you approve of those things, so it's inconsistent not to agree with just this other slightly different form of euthanasia. And I'll talk to you about why they are not euthanasia. And part of that strategy is to label refusals of treatment and fully adequate pain and suffering management. They call it passive euthanasia, and then they say, oh, well, active euthanasia is really not morally or ethically different. Therefore, if you're going to be consistent, you should either refuse both or agree with both. And so it's a very, very, very common mistake. And that confusion between what is euthanasia and what is not euthanasia is not accidental. It's been part of the strategy of people who are pro-euthanasia and want it legalized. So that's just a preliminary introduction. This area is huge. Just before I came here, I was writing an abstract for a paper that I have coming out in a journal out of Oxford called the Linacre Quarterly. And that is on the latest development in the euthanasia disputes. And it is that in in Canada and in the Netherlands and Belgium, they are allowing organ donation after euthanasia, and there's a big push to say this will solve the problem of organs for the shortage of organs for transplant. And so what they're doing with this is that they're killing the person and waiting to declare them dead, and there's a big argument about when is dead. We've got to try and work some more on that too. But then they say the next step that's just come out on this is, well, really, why wouldn't we do a better intervention, which is, instead of giving the person the lethal drugs, which messes up the organs to some degree, and waiting for them to die, which also makes the organs deteriorate, why don't we give them a general anaesthetic and do the euthanasia by removing their vital organs? So that's the article I've just got in press. It's called Does It Matter How We Die? And what does it mean to combine organ transplantation and euthanasia? And my recommendation is they should never be put together. It's extremely dangerous. There's a new book out called How Fear Works by an English sociologist called Frank Furedi. It's a very good book, actually. It's fairly long, but it's really good. And what that book shows is that what we fear matters to how we live our lives. And so, for example, when most people were religious, they used to fear judgment by God after death, and they would act accordingly to think that they'd get a good mark. But now many people are not religious, and their primary fear in relation to death is suffering while dying. I think legalizing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia can be seen as a response to this fear. It's what some social psychologists call a terror management device or a terror reduction mechanism, that you will get death before it gets you, that to the degree that you can, you will control death. And that is part of the progressives' mantra. It's part of the implementation of very intense individual autonomy, that you don't have to let anything happen to you that you don't want. You've got the right to decide. It's your choice. So that mantra is choice, control, and change, because in order to be able to do that, very often you've got to do things like change the law or change medical practice. So euthanasia allows these people to get death before it gets them. And it does manifest the progressive values mantra of this control, choice, and change. You take control of your death, you choose its time, place, and manner, and you change the law to allow this. People with more traditional or conservative values oppose such a change and see it as contravening their values, especially that of respect for human rights, human life, and that has resulted in serious conflict. So the question that we have to look at in our multicultural, multi-religious, secular societies is how do we manage that conflict? Can it be resolved? So, first, we need mutually respectful, honest and open discussion. We need to ask, is legalising euthanasia a good idea? The euthanasia debate is not about if we die. So far, we all will. But the transhumanists are trying to do something about that. There's science going on where their ultimate goal is immortality through science. I'm just mentioning that. The euthanasia debate is about how we die and whether a way of dying that involves doctors intentionally inflicting death on their patients should remain prohibited. I believe it should, and I hope to be able to explain to you why I hold that belief. Euthanasia does not involve just individuals and just the present time. It will have a major impact on society and on future generations. It's not a small step along a path we've already taken, but a radical and unprecedented change in some of the most important shared values on which we base our society. I suggest that history will judge our decision whether to accept or reject legalising euthanasia as the single most important values decision of the 21st century. To make the case against euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and from now on I'll just talk about euthanasia and I include both of those in it, we must first understand how the case for it is being made. We need to identify the pro-euthanasia strategies and the arguments for euthanasia and respond to them if we think that legalising euthanasia is a dangerous idea. Paradoxically, this need is even stronger after euthanasia is legalised if we are to have the best chance of limiting its impact. And I'm not very confident that we can limit its impact. I just got an email from Canada on Thursday evening, and in the Canadian law, it says you can only have euthanasia if a natural death is reasonably foreseeable. And that's been interpreted as meaning that the person must be terminally ill. That's when death becomes reasonably foreseeable. And then the doctors in the courts have said, and that means that you can say that they're likely to die in 6 to 12 months at the maximum. Well, 2 people in Montreal went to court saying that was an unjustified restriction on access to euthanasia in Canada. And on Thursday, the Quebec Superior Court struck down the requirement for reasonable foreseeability of natural death as contravening these people's rights to liberty and security of the person, that they had the right to choose for themselves without being restricted by having to be terminally ill. And so even when euthanasia gets legalised, that's not the end of the legal arguments or the challenges to the law. So what are the pro-euthanasia strategies and arguments used by its proponents? First, a general observation. Mainstream media are overwhelmingly pro-euthanasia. And I experienced that this afternoon because I had an interview broadcast on Radio National at 4 o'clock, but the interview was done last week, and they'd edited out some of my objections. So you can tell by the nature of the questions. For example, they introduced me as a Catholic bioethicist, which immediately puts a whole lot of people off even listening to what I might have to say that's wrong with euthanasia. They just whitewash that and think, oh, well, she's going to be against euthanasia because she's a Catholic. That's not the reason I'm against euthanasia, but that's the sort of thing that's happening all the time. So it's very difficult to impress journalists, and they're very keen to give standing ovations to people who stand up for legalising euthanasia and indeed stand up for any of the progressive values. Now, just to give you an idea of that, this is the major newspaper in Canada. It's called the Globe and Mail. It's the national newspaper of record. And that's the front page, the whole front page of the Globe and Mail on the Saturday morning, which is the biggest distribution day of the Globe and Mail. Some people only get the Saturday edition, they read it on the weekend. And this was the morning after the Supreme Court of Canada, that's like the High Court of Australia, 9-0 struck down the prohibition on euthanasia in the Criminal Code of Canada. They said it was unconstitutional, that people had a right to decide if they wanted to die and when they wanted to die. I'll tell you some more about that. But what is really interesting is how the media and also the pro-euthanasia people coat these proposals and these arguments. You see what is written, there's a very moving scene of obviously a man who's very sick walking down a dim lit corridor and a woman putting her arms around him to comfort him, and the big headline is "A Step Towards Kindness." And indeed what the Supreme Court had said was that it was cruel to deny people the right to have euthanasia. They said it was a cruel situation. And so a lot of the argument has centered around kindness and not being cruel and rights to decide for yourself. And what we now know about ethical decision-making is that emotions play a very important role in that decision-making, and I believe justifiably so. We have a thing in ethics called the Yuck Factor. If you hear of something and you say yuck, that's an emotional response and a moral intuition that something is wrong here. But if you put things in terms of kindness and loving and avoiding suffering for somebody, and you tell these really heart-wrenching stories about terrible deaths and what somebody wanted, then both your emotions and your intuitions go towards saying, well, why not, if that's what they want and they've given their informed consent, etc. I don't think we should do it. I think it's inherently wrong to intentionally kill another person, but that's the way the argument's being presented. Now what I want to do is move to the strategies to show you what the strategies are that are being used to promote euthanasia. And the first one is that we all agree on most issues approach. Now, when I write in bioethics, I do have a basic starting point of saying we should try to find a starting point where we do all agree, because it makes a difference if we can have an experience of belonging to the same moral universe before we move to our disagreements. Those disagreements often have a different tone when you can think back and think there were some things you agreed about. But I decided after a while that I was not going to do that with euthanasia, because what it did, it put me in a difficult position, that the person would say, well, look, we all agree treatment can be withdrawn. We all agree with totally adequate pain management and symptom relief. And you're just being difficult, that you won't agree with this little extra add-on that we think is much the same. And what it did, it makes you seem as though you are disagreeable, you are at fault, you're the one that's blocking the right way to go forward. And so I don't think that's a good idea in the euthanasia debate, although as a practical and a political reality, I don't think that we can do more than say, if this is what you believe, that you think it's inherently wrong in itself and cannot be justified, to act to intentionally end the life of another human being. The only exceptions are when that is the only reasonable way to save innocent human life. And the examples of that are self-defense, so-called just war. It used to be the justification of capital punishment, but is no longer. And it was the justification for a legal abortion, that when the mother's life was genuinely at risk, then abortion was always legal in that circumstance. So I think we've got to be careful about how much we agree and get swept into this river of, let's go with all of these things. It's really just to put you on notice. Now, the second strategy has 4 parts. First of all, the focus is placed on a suffering individual person who wants euthanasia and who's usually a person to whom our hearts go out. So you feel a lot of compassion and empathy for this person. I think you can also feel that, gosh, if I was in that situation, would I want that? Then there's I'll tell you about this in a moment. There's a reinterpretation of what does the right to life mean. There's advocacy of the right to choose, that you've got a right to choose how you die. That's part of intense individualism and the dominance of autonomy in the progressive values world. And finally, there's the cruelty of denial, that if you deny this, you are a cruel person. It's even been compared to cruel and unusual treatment or punishment, which is contrary to human rights. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a lot of human rights statements and charters of human rights. So we get a lot of very individual cases, and the focus is on that individual who's suffering, who's competent, who you feel empathy for, and who very adamantly wants euthanasia. And so that's what the court did in Canada, the Supreme Court that struck down a prohibition on euthanasia. It looked at this woman and more or less said, poor Mrs. Grace Taylor was her name, and she had multiple sclerosis, I think it was. Interestingly, she died of another disease, of an infection, before she could get euthanasia. So in the end, she didn't get it, but she was the test case. Then what the court did, it looked at, but you could look at this in any of our jurisdictions, because all of our jurisdictions recognise a right to life. In Australia, there's no Charter of Rights, but the courts clearly recognise a right to life. So what the Supreme Court of Canada did was turn the right to life into a right to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, you might wonder, how on earth could they manage that? I mean, it sounds like a magician's trick. Well, what they did was, they said that Mrs. Taylor, who is the plaintiff, would not commit suicide now if she could be assured that when the multiple sclerosis progresses and she's unable to commit suicide without the assistance of a doctor, that she could have that assistance. But at the present time, she can't have that assistance because assisting suicide is a crime, 14 years in jail under the Canadian Criminal Code. So what that prohibition does is it shortens her life, because she will commit suicide now. She said so, but she'll wait if you let her have assistance to do this. And so that period between doing it now and having assistance is a shortening of the right to life, a shortening of life, and that is a breach of the right to life in the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. I mean, it really boggles the mind. It turns the right to life into a right to assisted suicide and euthanasia. And then there was very much, this is my body, my decision. I want to have it under control. I'm a competent adult. Why shouldn't I have this? Well, what you can see with that is that once you say, yes, you're correct, we're going to give it to you on that basis, there is no logical or natural limit to the right to choose. And that's just what's happened in that Quebec case I just told you about. Why should we have to be terminally ill? We've got the right to choose. You've already recognised that. Why should that be limited? Makes sense. And then I've already talked to you about there's the cruelty of what your denial of the person's right to do this is characterised as being intense cruelty. Cruelty to them. You are making them suffer. And the court even held, this is amazing, that present anxiety about future suffering was sufficient present suffering to justify euthanasia. So, yeah, I know. I mean, it's really, as I said, it's an extremely expansive judgment and with no natural limits. Now, what happened was the court gave the Parliament of Canada 12 months to pass a law that would allow euthanasia and assisted suicide, and that's what the federal Parliament did. But they put in some conditions, like having to be terminally ill, and now those conditions are being challenged as being both inconsistent with charter rights to liberty and security of the person. The court held that your security of your person meant that you should be able to not be anxious. So if something was making you anxious, that was an infringement of your security of your person. And so the fact that you couldn't get euthanasia is making you anxious, that would have to be justified, and they held it wasn't justified to restrict it. So they said that people suffer from the knowledge that they lack the ability to bring a peaceful end to their lives at a time and in a manner of their own choosing. Now, one of the problems has been that we haven't had any stories on the other side, or if we do, people haven't wanted to listen to them, about people who do have good deaths, who have a peaceful, accompanied death with loving people and proper, fully adequate palliative care, which is physical, mental, social and spiritual care. And we also have not had stories of bad euthanasia deaths. There's a few starting to come out now. There's been a case in the Netherlands where this old lady wrote an advance directive that said she might consider euthanasia when the time was right. She, in the meantime, got dementia. Her general practitioner doctor decided one day that she should be euthanized. She put drugs in her coffee, sleeping drugs. The old woman passed out. The doctor notified the family that she was going to euthanize the old lady, and they came in to be present, and halfway through the lethal injection, she woke up and started struggling and saying, no, no, no. And the doctor asked the family to hold her down while she completed the injection. Now, that went before the euthanasia committee, And they found that the doctor not have continued, but that she'd acted in good faith, therefore had not done anything that merited deregistering her. That case has since gone to the courts in the Netherlands, and I think I'm right in saying this, just in the last couple of weeks, the court have decided that there was no criminal act in what happened. So that's the sort of thing that we've got to think about. So the other thing that's being alleged is that the absence of access to euthanasia is actually state-imposed suffering, which is contrary to human rights.